Okay. So could you please tell us your names and the official name of the building or property on the City of Salmon Arm's Heritage Register?
James and Harriett Hanna, and it would be the Dodd Hanna Orchard.
Dodd Hanna Orchard? Mm-hmm. So you are former owner?
We are former owners.
Mm-hmm. And how long were you associated with the heritage property?
How many years was that? 47?
I was associated probably 60.
You were 67
Since
when we
1950.
left.
Since 1950?
Yeah, and 69 then. We were together after we were married. We were there since 1975, so, and until 2019. So you figure it out.
I'm not going to embarrass myself on the record with mental
No, I'm
math.
not either.
So a lifetime.
Okay, so did you grow up there?
Yes.
Okay.
Not in that house.
Not in that house, but on the orchard.
Yeah, it was his
Next door to
grandfather's
the
house. And he lived next door with his family.
Okay. So the next question is what initially drew you to this property, but you're obviously a lifetime there. What kept you there so long, I guess?
The business.
Mm-hmm.
The orchard kept us there. And it was an investment in the family's future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was Granddad's home, but he hadn't lived there for a few years because of failing health. He had lived next door with his son and daughter-in-law, and so the house was not in the best repair anymore, but he said that we could have it for fixing it up. Okay. So that when you're young and married and you're living in an apartment downtown was an appealing prospect. Mm-hmm. And so we bit the bullet and we re-gyprocked and rewired and replumbed and got everything, up to standards. And we didn't change the windows or anything at that point, and we didn't insulate either. That came later, but it was livable at that point.
And how old was that building?
I think parts of the house were built in the 1920s. Okay. And then
it was built before that because Dodd family lived in there when
they lived up
there.
on Broadview.
Yeah, for a time, but probably I would say the place was probably built 1910. Maybe.
No, too early.
Too early?
Yeah, it was around 1918 to 1920. That's the earliest it could have been built. And I don't think it was very big to begin with because each generation has put an addition on. Mm-hmm. And we can tell where the original house was. The kitchen part at one time was a lean-to, like when we first lived into it. When we added onto it in 1994, then we changed the roof line so that it became one roof line instead of having, different multiples. Mm-hmm. And so, it did have different stages through its life. And I think probably the original builders were probably Edwin Dodd and his sons, who were Adela's brothers, mm-hmm. because at least one of them was a carpenter, that much we know. And some stuff in the old living room, which is now the office, like the built-in bookcase and that sort of thing, that was made by one of her brothers.
Okay.
So.
And is it the only building on the property?
Because we didn't get there until later, you would have to say there was an addition to the house that was the milk house. There was a dairy operation there, very small. They had jerseys, so there was a barn that's still there, the log barn, and next to it was a bigger barn where they had kept horses because at one time, of course, before tractors, they had horses. Mm-hmm. So that barn is long gone, but the log barn is still there that was used for the dairy. And next to our house was a garage that was still there, and we used it for a number of years. And it was getting a little worse for wear.
So we've been discussing changes that you made to the house over time. Were any other changes made on the property itself, like with the orchard or in the farming aspect?
Considerable changes in the orchard.
And the farming aspect
and
too.
the farming aspect,
yeah.
the way we farm. There's no irrigation in Salmon Arm for orchards. So prior to us, my brother and I taking over the orchard, we
Which was about 1980.
Yeah, we tilled the orchard and made a dust mulch through the summer, so 8 inches of powdery soil. We'd work it up. And
believe me, it was
stopped.
powdery. You walked through it and it was poof, poof, poof. And when it rained, you had 6 inches of mud under your shoes.
Oh.
Yeah, but the dust mulch broke the capillary action, and so the water wouldn't evaporate off.
Okay.
So
what was done before that?
So that was before, and then we planted turf between the rows, and then
You're looking at a dairyman's daughter, and I grew up with green all around me, and I'm looking out at this dust bowl we're living in the middle of, and I'm going, can we do something about this? And so we did something. We put turf. Well, we grew seed between the rows, and
seeded turf.
yeah, and grew this grass that didn't grow all that high, so it didn't need to be mowed all the time. And lo and behold, even though conventional wisdom around here said you can't do that, it worked just fine.
And why it worked was because you weren't breaking soil structure. So wormholes, insect holes, the life in the soil improved because now you've got an insect and microbial action happening. And so when it rained, the water went down 3 feet instead of just being absorbed by this 8 inches of dust and making mud.
It didn't really get absorbed by the 8 inches of dust, not easily anyway.
Didn't go in. I mean, so you would, summer rains would not penetrate down to the roots through the dust.
So with the dust thing, it was meant to be retain the water, but it didn't do it efficiently.
Well, it didn't allow water in, and it didn't allow water out. So what you got in the winter is what you got. So summer rains did not penetrate well into the soil. But when we turfed it, then we didn't break the soil structure, and so water would penetrate down deeper. And I think it worked well. Actually cooled the soil somewhat as well.
Did that start a trend? Did other orchards take up that? Yeah.
No, not
so
really.
Much,
No, because Petersons have a totally different situation. They have a more, we have heavy clay, and clay is notorious for holding water, so that's a plus. They have more of a gravelly soil, and the rock is very close to the surface. So for them, it may not be a viable option, so they've never done it. They've continued the tillage. And Ruth, I think, continued the tillage just because that was the way they'd always done it. So, yeah, I think we're the only ones in Salmon Arm. I mean, down the valley, oh yeah, everybody does turf.
Ruth's since gone to turf.
Okay. But they didn't during the years when we were really active. No.
Anyway, it was interesting. And then we went to higher density orchards.
When were the first orchards planted? Do you remember?
In Salmon Arm?
No, at Hanna's.
Oh, well, great-grandfather Dodd had orchard.
but it was primarily mixed farming. He had
Yeah.
cattle, and he grew hay and, you know, other things. It wasn't just orchard, not
No, it
like when
wasn't
we were doing
completely
it.
orchard. I mean, but he did have orchard. There was orchard there.
Yeah. So
Yeah. And the tree spacing was 30 by 30. In
that
rows,
was when
which
they were tilling between the trees, on the principle that the trees, because they were much larger, they were not dwarf trees, they needed that amount of room to be able to harvest the water in the soil that was there. So very wide spacings, and that changed over the years dramatically.
So that would be about 50 trees per acre.
And are there still original trees there? Like
There are, I think, about 8 original Spartan trees, which was developed in Summerland. They were planted just after the 49-50 frost. And
Some of the
those
earliest Spartans, were they still a numbered tree when you got them, or were they already named?
I think they may have been numbered when we got them, but
Yeah.
they were named very shortly after.
When Summerland first releases trees or develops trees, they're just numbered during the experimental process, and then they will come up with a name if it's a successful variety, because it takes years to develop a variety. So anyway, and we still have a few. Well, I should say they still have a few of those over there, but just because they're historical and the trees are still producing well. Not so much. They were.
They're pretty near stumps.
Oh, okay. Yeah, a lot has happened
moment,
in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's being turned around. Brad is
making
an
big
awesome
difference.
job of turning it around.
Yeah.
And I'm assisting him a bit. But anyway, yeah. So the big change was in the planting style, where 40 acres of orchard, approximately, well, there might have been 60 acres of orchard, which would have had about 3,500 trees, maybe up to 4,000. My brother and I changed and went higher density plantings and had over 28,000
Well,
trees.
initially you went to semi-dwarf, and there wouldn't have been that many. But then you went to dwarf, and when we had both orchards, the one further up Broadview and the home place, and with the higher density with the dwarf trees, then you had 28,000.
I think that's what I said. We eventually had 28,000.
You eventually did.
Yeah. So it was a significant number more trees, and quality of fruit improved. Instead of growing a structure, like limbs to hold the fruit, you now grew fruit, and it was more productive and better quality fruit. We consistently ranked in the top 5 of growers in BC for our varieties. Some varieties were number 1. Honeycrisp, for instance, were number 1 in BC.
So the barn, the log barn that is there now, that was used for the beef cattle, then became where we sold apples from. And it was initially very open, and then over the years we enclosed it, and you can sell apples and have cash in your pocket, but when you have a cash register and you have anything else, then you really need to have a little more safety and security. So anyway, it eventually became an enclosed building and all that sort of thing, which is what is there now. So, and it too has changed a little bit, but we put cold storage in it so that we can put the apples in the back and have the sales in the front. So, yeah, that's how the whole sales thing transitioned. So, and it went from being 2 months, from September and October in the fall, to eventually becoming summer as well, when we started bringing in other fruit from other growers and being open for a longer season, including the summer. And then eventually we had people say, because I am a horticulturist and I was working for Davidson seasonally, they were a garden center down the street here. They would say, why don't you open a garden center? And I'm going, you know what? We already have one business. That's enough trouble. And then we finally thought, well, you know, if we did, then we could extend the season even further. And we were open year-round for a few years, but we found that was really difficult. It would be fine up until Christmas, which included a whole Christmas decor and all that sort of stuff. But winter, when it's really quiet and nobody wants to drive into a snowy parking lot and you're out of town, very difficult. So we closed for the winter months because we decided we actually didn't mind having it quiet for a while and not having to deal with all that.
And not having to heat a building.
Yeah. But for the greater part, during the years when we had the garden center, we were open from late March, through to the end of October, middle of November, something like that. So yeah, those were all choice. It's, you know what, the land is in the agricultural land reserve. And when you can't make a living growing fruit or apples, you have to find ways to make a living within that ALR, because we're totally, first off, we were very committed to the whole historical aspect of the Hanna family, you know, 4th generation. And I mean, we used to say to people, well, we hate to be the generation that loses the family farm. And I can remember Kevin Stadnick saying, do you realize what kind of pressure you're putting on yourselves and on your kids? And I had never thought of it that way. I just thought, you know, this is what you do. And I'm a 1st generation Canadian, so having land was really an important part of how I looked at things. I grew up on a dairy farm. My dad had nothing when he came to Canada and was eventually able to purchase a dairy farm. So, you know, just that whole thing was important to me. But anyway, where was I going with this? We told our kids, because there are difficulties. When you're in farming, there are difficulties. And because we didn't have backups, like, you know, I could work seasonally, basically spring, because there are not greenhouses and stuff here where you can use your horticultural expertise. And James's winter paychecks were pretty small because you're paid by the hour and days are short, so there weren't the backups for him either. He couldn't just go out and work somewhere else in the winter. So we told our kids that they had to get an education, they had to make lives for themselves. If they then wanted to come and be part of the farm, that was fine, but they had to have a backup. And they had to be passionate about it. And neither one of them was. And I thought maybe Stuart's son Chris would take it on, but he really didn't want to go that direction either. He's now a paramedic. And so anyway, when it came time to sell the farm, I'm off topic, I know. But anyway, we actually hadn't even thought about selling the farm. We had another farm up on Broadview at 30th and 30th, and it had been on the market. We decided to try and sell it to raise some cash, and nobody was interested. 10 years on the market, nobody even looked. And so I started thinking about that, and James and I were talking one day, and I said, maybe we should sell, because it's not going to be easy for our kids either if there's transition. And so anyway, we talked to Stuart about it, and that's what we eventually did, put it on the market. And it took a while. and it did eventually sell. But, you know, I never thought that we would retire. I seriously thought we were working on the Freedom 95 program, that I'd be out in the orchard with my boots on, you know, keel over dead. So, you know, there just didn't seem to be that many options, because you have the ALR, there are limits to what you can do. And so we did what we could. Anyway, enough of that.
Are you enjoying retirement though?
Absolutely. Love it. We both do.
It's great.
Yeah.
And it's getting better.
Well,
Brad will do well.
I hope so. Yeah. Brad is full of ideas, and he's a man of action. So we're very hopeful. It's exciting.
I talked to Brad as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what words of wisdom would you share with people thinking about taking on the overall property, including the orchard? Like what advice would you give Brad as he was trying to rehabilitate it and stuff?
I talk to Brad a lot, so yeah.
Yeah.
I've been working with him.
What would you say?
And
There's no one thing you can say. You just that you address the issues. And the issue when they purchased last year was that the sterile insect release program
was
people
bulldoze the orchard.
They wanted to bulldoze the whole orchard. Can you imagine going from one of the best orchards in BC to having such a problem with codling moth that they wanted to eradicate the whole thing?
Court order to bulldoze the orchard, and Brad managed to put a halt to that. And
bit of a compromise in that the worst section was that right along Broadview, and so last year you might have noticed that whole section came out, and you know, tree stumps and everything were piled there, and it was going to be burned because that's fastest, easiest way to get rid of the problem. But then burning restrictions came in, and so they covered the whole thing with black plastic, you know, so that codling moth cooked in there, which is another way to do it, right? And then they burned in the fall when it was safe to do it. But yeah, Brad's doing a really good job, and he is steep learning curve for him, but he asks questions and he follows. He's learning, and so that's what you can do.
An hour already.
Yeah, I'll do my last question. If you had one word to describe your building or your property, what would it be?
It's improving right now.
Improving.
Depends.
It's improving.
Depends
yeah.
when.
Oh, anytime.
When you want to look at the thing, right?
So in one word, before you left.
How would you describe
How was it?
Yeah, how would you describe it?
I thought it was beautiful.
Showplace.
It was a showplace.